You think you know the story of the American Revolution. Noble patriots standing up to British tyranny, peaceful protests escalating into righteous rebellion, the birth of a nation founded on liberty and justice. But what if I told you that, before the Boston Massacre, before the Tea Party, before the shot heard round the world, there was a darker chapter that history has carefully erased? This is the story they don't want you to know. The story of the Shadow Sons, a radical faction within the Sons of Liberty, who believed that freedom could only be won through terror, who planned kidnappings, assassinations, and coordinated attacks that would have turned Boston into a battlefield years before Lexington and Concord, who came within days of unleashing a campaign of violence that could have destroyed the very cause they claimed to serve. But this isn't just another tale of revolutionary fervor. This is the untold story of Seamus O'Brien, an Irish immigrant caught between his hatred of British oppression and his fear that extremism would poison the wells of liberty forever. A man who had to choose between exposing future American heroes or allowing them to commit acts that would make them no better than the tyrants they opposed. Welcome to the dark side of the American Revolution, where the line between patriot and terrorist was thinner than you ever imagined, and where the price of preventing one atrocity might have been enabling another. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the founding of America, the nature of political violence, and the terrible choices that ordinary people must make when revolution hangs in the balance. February 14th, 1770. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston's North End is thick with pipe smoke and revolutionary fervor, but in the back room where the real business is conducted, the conversation has taken a decidedly darker turn. Samuel Adams sits at the head of a rough wooden table, his piercing eyes scanning the faces of the men who have gathered for this clandestine meeting. These are not the moderate merchants and respectable citizens who make up the public face of the Sons of Liberty. These are the true believers, the men who have grown tired of petitions and protests and peaceful resistance that seems to accomplish nothing but British laughter. Gentlemen, Adams begins, his voice carrying the authority of a man who has dedicated his life to the cause of American liberty. We have tried reason, we have tried economic pressure, we have tried appeals to justice and British law. And what has it gained us? More troops, more taxes, more humiliation. Around the table, heads nod in grim agreement. These men have watched British soldiers patrol their streets, have seen their businesses strangled by imperial regulations, have endured the daily indignities of living under foreign occupation. They are merchants like Thomas Hutchinson Jr., whose father serves as the royal governor, artisans like Paul Revere, whose silver work has made him prosperous enough to risk everything for principle, and laborers like Ebenezer Mackintosh, who leads the mob when genteel protests need muscle. But tonight, there are new faces at the table, men whose names will never appear in the sanitized histories of the Revolution, whose methods would make even hardened patriots uncomfortable. They call themselves the Shadow Sons, and they believe that liberty can only be purchased with blood. The leader of this radical faction is a man known only as the Carpenter. His real name is lost to history, deliberately erased from records that might have implicated more famous patriots in his schemes. He's a tall, lean man, with the calloused hands of someone who works with tools, but his eyes burn with the fervor of a true believer who has moved beyond conventional morality. Brother Adams speaks truth, the Carpenter says, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggests origins in the backcountry rather than Boston's refined society. But he does not speak the whole truth. The British understand only one language, the language of fear. Until we make them afraid, until we make the cost of oppression higher than the cost of retreat, they will continue to grind us under their boot. The proposal he outlines is breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. The Shadow Sons have been planning for months, identifying targets, gathering intelligence, preparing for a coordinated campaign of terror that would make British rule in Massachusetts impossible to maintain. The plan includes kidnapping royal officials and holding them for ransom, not money, but political concessions. Burning the homes of prominent loyalists, starting with those who have profited most from British favor, assassinating customs officers and tax collectors, making it clear that collaboration with the Crown carries a death sentence. And most shocking of all, attacking British soldiers in their barracks, killing them in their sleep to demonstrate that no servant of the King is safe in Boston. "You're talking about murder," says Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the more moderate voices in the Sons of Liberty. Cold-blooded assassination. How does that make us different from the tyrants we oppose? The carpenter's smile is cold and calculating. The difference, Doctor, is that we kill for liberty while they kill for profit. We shed blood to free our people while they shed blood to enslave them. History will judge us as heroes, not murderers. It's a seductive argument, especially to men who have watched their rights eroded year by year, who have seen peaceful protest met with military force, who have begun to believe that their only choice is between submission and violence. But it's also a dangerous one, because once you cross the line into terrorism, there's no going back to moral high ground. The debate that follows reveals the deep divisions within the Patriot movement, divisions that history has largely forgotten in its eagerness to present a unified narrative of noble resistance. Some of the men around the table are genuinely horrified by the carpenter's proposals, understanding that such tactics would destroy any hope of reconciliation with Britain and turn the colonies into a battlefield. Others are intrigued, seeing violence as the logical next step in a conflict that has already moved beyond legal remedies. Samuel Adams himself remains carefully neutral, neither endorsing nor condemning the Shadow Sons' plans. It's a calculated ambiguity that allows him to maintain plausible deniability while keeping his options open. If the terror campaign succeeds in forcing British concessions, he can claim credit for supporting bold action. If it fails and provokes massive retaliation, he can distance himself from the extremists and preserve his reputation as a moderate leader. But there's one man in the room who is listening to this debate with growing horror, understanding that he's witnessing the planning of atrocities that could destroy everything the Patriot cause claims to represent. Seamus O'Brien sits in the shadows near the back of the room, officially present as a representative of the Irish labourers, who make up a significant portion of Boston's working class. At 28, he's been in America for only 2 years, having fled Ireland after participating in agrarian protests that brought him to the attention of British authorities. He hates the Crown with a passion born of personal experience. He's seen what British justice looks like when applied to rebellious Irishmen, but he's also seen what happens when political movements embrace terrorism as a tactic. In Ireland, he witnessed the cycle of violence and retaliation that turned legitimate grievances into blood feuds, that transformed freedom fighters into common murderers, that gave oppressive governments the excuse they needed to justify even harsher measures. As he listens to the carpenter outline his plans for kidnapping and assassination, Seamus feels a familiar chill of recognition. These are the same arguments he heard in Irish taverns, the same justifications for violence that led to burned farms and murdered landlords, and ultimately the brutal suppression that drove him into exile. "The British will use this against us," he says quietly, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "They'll paint all patriots as terrorists, use your violence to justify their oppression. You'll give them everything they need to destroy the entire movement." The carpenter turns his cold gaze on the Irishman, seeing him perhaps for the first time as more than just another pair of hands for the cause. "And what would you have us do, brother? Continue to beg for scraps from the master's table? Accept whatever crumbs of liberty they choose to grant us? I would have us be better than them," Seamus replies, his voice gaining strength as he speaks. "I would have us prove that free men can govern themselves without resorting to the tactics of tyrants. I would have us win this fight without losing our souls in the process." It's a noble sentiment, but it falls on deaf ears among men who have grown tired of nobility and hungry for results. The carpenter dismisses Seamus's concerns with a wave of his hand, and the planning continues. The meeting breaks up near midnight, with the Shadow Sons agreeing to begin their campaign within the week. The first target will be Thomas Hutchinson Sr., the royal governor, who will be kidnapped from his mansion and held until the British agree to withdraw all troops from Boston. If that doesn't work, they'll escalate to more violent measures. As the conspirators file out of the Green Dragon, Seamus finds himself facing an impossible choice. He can remain silent and allow the terror campaign to proceed, knowing that it will likely provoke a British crackdown that destroys the entire Patriot movement, or he can expose the plot and save the cause of liberty by betraying the men who claim to serve it. It's the kind of moral dilemma that has no good answers, where every choice leads to tragedy, where doing the right thing might require becoming a traitor to your own side. Seamus walks the dark streets of Boston, wrestling with his conscience and trying to find a path that doesn't lead to disaster. Around him the city sleeps peacefully, unaware that it stands on the brink of a violence that could change the course of American history. But time is running out, and soon he'll have to choose between his loyalty to the Patriot cause and his commitment to the principles that cause claims to represent. The Shadow Sons are preparing to cross a line that can never be uncrossed, and only one man stands in their way. The question is whether he has the courage to stop them, and whether stopping them might be an even greater betrayal than letting them proceed. February 18th, 1770. 4 days after the meeting at the Green Dragon, Seamus O'Brien watches from his boarding house window as members of the Shadow Sons conduct surveillance on Governor Hutchinson's mansion on Beacon Hill. They're not being subtle about it. Thomas Melville, a cousin of the future author Herman Melville, stands across from the governor's residence pretending to read a newspaper while obviously counting guards and noting their patrol patterns. James Swan, a young merchant who will later become one of Boston's wealthiest citizens, walks past the mansion's gates repeatedly, each time taking a slightly different route to map escape routes. The amateurish nature of their reconnaissance both reassures and terrifies Seamus. These men are clearly not professional conspirators. They're angry citizens who have convinced themselves that violence is the only solution to their political problems. Their lack of experience might make their plot easier to stop, but it also makes it more likely to go catastrophically wrong. The plan, as Seamus learned during subsequent meetings, is breathtakingly ambitious and terrifyingly reckless. The Shadow Sons intend to kidnap Governor Hutchinson during his weekly carriage ride to visit his country estate in Milton. They'll hold him in a safe house in the countryside, while demanding that all British troops be withdrawn from Boston and that the most oppressive taxes be repealed. If the British refuse to negotiate, they'll execute Hutchinson and move on to their next target, Lieutenant Colonel William Dalrymple, commander of the British garrison. The escalation will continue until either the British capitulate or Boston becomes ungovernable. What makes the plot even more dangerous is the involvement of legitimate Patriot leaders who may not fully understand what they're endorsing. Samuel Adams continues to maintain his careful ambiguity, neither supporting nor condemning the Shadow Sons, while ensuring that he has plausible deniability if things go wrong. Paul Revere has been recruited to create a network of signal riders who can coordinate the various phases of the operation. Even Dr. Joseph Warren, despite his earlier objections, has agreed to provide medical support for any conspirators who are wounded during the kidnapping. The participation of these respected figures gives the Shadow Sons a legitimacy they wouldn't otherwise possess, but it also means that their failure could destroy the entire Patriot leadership. If the plot is exposed, the British won't distinguish between moderate patriots and radical terrorists. They'll use the conspiracy as justification for crushing all resistance to royal authority. Seamus's dilemma deepens when he realizes that he's not the only one with doubts about the Shadow Sons' methods. During a chance encounter at Faneuil Hall, he overhears a conversation between John Hancock and Josiah Quincy Jr. that reveals the growing divisions within the Patriot movement. Hancock, one of Boston's wealthiest merchants, is clearly uncomfortable with the direction the resistance is taking. "This madness will destroy everything we've worked for," Hancock says, his voice tight with anxiety. "If they kidnap the governor, the British will declare martial law. They'll suspend all civil government, arrest anyone suspected of sedition, and turn Massachusetts into a military dictatorship." Quincy, a young lawyer who has made his reputation defending British soldiers accused of crimes against colonists, nods grimly. "The moderates in Parliament who might support our cause will abandon us the moment we resort to terrorism. We'll be branded as rebels and criminals, and any hope of peaceful resolution will be lost forever." But despite their concerns, neither man seems willing to take action to stop the conspiracy. They're caught in the same trap that has paralyzed much of the Patriot leadership, afraid to oppose the extremists for fear of being branded as traitors to the cause, but equally afraid to support them for fear of the consequences. It's a dynamic that Seamus recognizes from his experience in Ireland, where moderate nationalists were often intimidated into silence by more radical factions, allowing extremism to flourish unchecked until it provoked the very crackdown it claimed to be fighting against. The moral complexity of the situation becomes even clearer when Seamus learns more about the individual members of the Shadow Sons and their motivations. The carpenter, despite his extremist methods, is driven by genuine grievances that would resonate with any reasonable person. His real name is Jonathan Wheelwright, and he's a master craftsman whose business has been destroyed by British trade regulations that favor imported goods over colonial manufactures. He's watched his apprentices leave for other trades, seen his family's standard of living decline steadily, and concluded that the economic system imposed by Britain is designed to keep colonists in permanent subjugation. Thomas Melville, the amateur spy watching the governor's mansion, is motivated by personal as well as political grievances. His younger brother was impressed into service aboard a British naval vessel, essentially kidnapped by the Royal Navy and forced to serve in conditions that amount to slavery. The family's appeals to colonial authorities have been ignored, and their petitions to London have disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of imperial administration. Even the most violent members of the conspiracy have understandable reasons for their extremism. James Swan lost his father to a British customs raid that went wrong when overzealous officers shot an unarmed merchant who was slow to comply with their demands. The official investigation cleared the customs men of any wrongdoing, ruling the death an unfortunate accident that was ultimately the victim's own fault. These are not monsters or madmen, but ordinary people who have been pushed beyond their breaking point by a system that offers them no legal recourse for legitimate grievances. Their turn toward violence is wrong, but it's also comprehensible, the logical result of a political system that refuses to address injustice through peaceful means. This understanding makes Seamus's choice even more difficult. How do you betray men whose anger is justified even if their methods are not? How do you preserve a system that has failed to protect the innocent even if the alternative is chaos? The answer comes to him during a conversation with his landlady, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, an elderly Irish widow who has become something of a mother figure to him since his arrival in Boston. "You're troubled, lad," she observes, as she serves him his evening meal. "I can see it in your eyes. You're carrying a burden that's too heavy for one man." Seamus finds himself telling her about the conspiracy, carefully avoiding names and specific details, but describing the moral dilemma he faces. Mrs. Sullivan listens without judgment, her weathered face reflecting the wisdom of someone who has lived through enough tragedy to understand the complexity of human motivation. "In the old country," she says finally, "I saw good men do terrible things for good reasons. I saw them justify murder as patriotism, excuse brutality as necessity, and I saw how it poisoned them, how it turned them into the very monsters they claimed to be fighting." She pauses, staring into the fire that warms her modest parlor. "But I also saw what happened to those who stood by and did nothing while evil flourished. They told themselves they were being prudent, that it wasn't their responsibility, that someone else would act. And when the reckoning came, they found that their silence had made them complicit in every atrocity they failed to prevent. It's the wisdom of experience speaking, the hard-earned knowledge of someone who has seen the consequences of both action and inaction." Mrs. Sullivan doesn't tell Seamus what to do, but she gives him the framework for making his own decision. The next morning, Seamus makes his choice. He goes to Lieutenant Colonel Dalrymple, the British commander who is himself one of the Shadow Sun's intended targets. It's a dangerous gamble. If Dalrymple doesn't believe him or handles the information badly, Seamus could find himself arrested as a conspirator rather than protected as an informant. But Dalrymple is a professional soldier, not a political appointee, and he understands the difference between legitimate intelligence and fabricated accusations. He listens to Seamus's account with growing alarm, asking pointed questions that demonstrate both his military expertise and his political acumen. "You understand," Dalrymple says when Seamus finishes his account, "that this information puts me in a difficult position. If I act on it, I'll be accused of using spies and informants to suppress legitimate political activity. If I don't act on it, and these men carry out their threats, I'll be responsible for the consequences." It's the same dilemma that has paralyzed the Patriot leadership, but from the opposite perspective. Dalrymple can't ignore a credible threat against the royal governor, but he also can't afford to be seen as the heavy-handed oppressor who crushes political dissent with military force. The solution he proposes is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Instead of arresting the conspirators, Dalrymple will use the intelligence to prevent their plot from succeeding while making it appear that their failure is due to their own incompetence rather than official intervention. Governor Hutchinson will suddenly change his travel plans, claiming illness. Extra guards will be posted at key locations, but their presence will be explained as routine security measures. The Shadow Sons will find their carefully laid plans frustrated at every turn, but they won't know why. It's a strategy that will save lives and prevent the terror campaign from beginning, but it will also leave the conspirators free to try again. And it will leave Seamus in the impossible position of having to continue his double life, pretending to support men he has betrayed, while knowing that his betrayal may not be enough to stop them permanently. The Shadow Sons are about to discover that their revolution has been compromised from within, and the man who saved Boston from terrorism is about to learn that preventing one atrocity sometimes requires enabling another. February 22nd, 1770. The kidnapping of Governor Hutchinson is scheduled for this morning, but everything that can go wrong is going wrong. The carpenter stands in the pre-dawn darkness outside the governor's mansion, watching his carefully laid plans crumble before his eyes. Hutchinson's carriage, which should have departed for Milton an hour ago, remains in the courtyard. Extra guards patrol the grounds, their presence unexplained but undeniably threatening. Worst of all, several key members of the conspiracy have failed to appear at their assigned positions. "Something's wrong," Thomas Melville whispers, his voice tight with anxiety. "This feels like a trap." The carpenter's cold eyes scan the street, looking for signs of British soldiers or colonial militia who might be waiting to spring an ambush. But everything appears normal. Just the usual morning activity of a prosperous neighborhood. Servants running errands, merchants opening their shops, citizens going about their daily business. That normalcy is itself suspicious. If the British knew about the plot, they would have arrested the conspirators by now. If they didn't know, the governor's sudden change in routine is an impossible coincidence. The only explanation that makes sense is that someone has warned the authorities without providing enough detail to justify arrests. "We have a traitor," the carpenter says quietly, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who has reached an inescapable conclusion. "Someone has betrayed us." The accusation hangs in the air like smoke from a musket volley, poisoning the atmosphere of trust that has held the conspiracy together. The Shadow Sons look at each other with sudden suspicion, each wondering if the man beside him is the Judas who has sold them to their enemies. But the carpenter's suspicions fall not on his fellow conspirators, but on the Irish immigrant who has been asking too many questions and expressing too many doubts about their methods. 3 blocks away, Seamus O'Brien sits in his boarding house room, staring out the window at the city he may have saved from terrorism. He should feel relief, satisfaction, even pride at having prevented a catastrophe that could have destroyed the patriot cause. Instead, he feels only a hollow emptiness, the bitter knowledge that his betrayal has accomplished nothing more than delaying the inevitable. The Shadow Sons are still free, still angry, still convinced that violence is the only solution to their political problems. Preventing one plot won't change their fundamental beliefs or address the grievances that drove them to extremism in the first place. If anything, their failure will only make them more desperate, more willing to take risks, more likely to escalate to even more violent tactics. His fears are confirmed when Mrs. Sullivan brings him news from the street. "There's talk of a meeting tonight," she says, her voice heavy with concern. "The men who were planning, whatever it was they were planning, they're gathering again, and they're angry, lad. Angrier than I've ever seen them." The emergency meeting of the Shadow Sons takes place not at the Green Dragon, which now feels compromised, but in the basement of a cooperage in the South End. The atmosphere is poisonous with suspicion and rage, as men who have risked everything for their cause try to understand how their carefully laid plans could have failed so completely. The carpenter wastes no time on pleasantries or explanations. He's already reached his conclusion about who is responsible for their failure, and he's prepared to act on it. "Brothers," he begins, his voice carrying the authority of a man who has moved beyond conventional morality, "we have been betrayed by one who claimed to share our cause. The Irishman O'Brien has sold us to our enemies, trading our blood for British gold." The accusation is met with angry murmurs from the assembled conspirators, but also with some skepticism. Seamus has been a faithful member of the Sons of Liberty for 2 years, has participated in protests and boycotts, has shown no signs of loyalty to the Crown. "What proof do you have?" asks James Swan, who despite his youth has emerged as one of the more thoughtful members of the group. The carpenter's evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Seamus was present at all the planning meetings, knew the details of the plot, and had expressed doubts about their methods. More importantly, he had the means and opportunity to contact the British authorities without being detected. He claims to hate the Crown because of what happened in Ireland, the carpenter continues, but perhaps his hatred is not as pure as he pretends. Perhaps he has made his peace with our oppressors, chosen British gold over American liberty. It's a plausible theory, but it's also wrong in almost every detail. Seamus hasn't been paid by the British, hasn't made any deals with colonial authorities, hasn't even been in contact with Lieutenant Colonel Dalrymple since their single meeting. His betrayal was motivated not by greed or loyalty to the Crown, but by the conviction that terrorism would destroy the very cause it claimed to serve. But the Shadow Sons are beyond caring about nuance or complexity. They need someone to blame for their failure, someone to punish for their humiliation, someone whose suffering can restore their sense of power and purpose. The sentence they pass is death. The penalty for treason is execution, the carpenter declares, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. O'Brien will die as an example to any others who might consider betraying our cause. The execution is scheduled for the following night, to be carried out in the same basement where the sentence was pronounced. It will be a ritual killing, designed not just to eliminate a traitor, but to bind the surviving conspirators together through shared guilt and blood. But Seamus has allies among the moderate patriots who are horrified by the Shadow Sons' descent into vigilante justice. Dr. Joseph Warren, despite his earlier cooperation with the conspiracy, draws the line at murder. When he learns of the death sentence through his network of contacts in the radical movement, he immediately begins working to save Seamus's life. Warren's intervention comes in the form of a warning delivered by Paul Revere, who appears at Seamus's boarding house just after midnight on February 23rd. "You need to leave Boston," Revere says without preamble. "Tonight. The Shadow Sons have marked you for death, and they plan to carry out the sentence tomorrow." Seamus listens to the warning with a mixture of fear and resignation. He's known since the moment he betrayed the conspiracy that there would be consequences, that men like the carpenter don't forgive or forget betrayal. The only surprise is that it has taken them this long to identify him as the source of their failure. "Where can I go?" he asks. They have friends throughout Massachusetts, contacts in other colonies. "How far do I have to run to be safe from their vengeance?" Revere's answer is both practical and heartbreaking. "Far enough that you'll never be able to come back." The escape plan is simple but effective. Revere will provide a horse and supplies for a journey to New York, where Seamus can book passage on a ship to the Caribbean or Europe. Dr. Warren will provide letters of introduction to Patriot sympathizers in other colonies, men who will help him establish a new life under a new identity. It's a generous offer from men who have every reason to see Seamus as a traitor to their cause, but it comes with a price that goes beyond money or favors. By accepting their help, Seamus will be acknowledging that his betrayal of the Shadow Sons was also a betrayal of the broader Patriot movement, that his attempt to save the cause of liberty has instead forced him into permanent exile from it. But the alternative is death, and Seamus chooses life. He leaves Boston before dawn on February 24th, riding south through the countryside he has come to love, knowing that he will never see it again. Behind him, the city sleeps peacefully, unaware that it has been saved from a terror campaign that could have changed the course of American history. The Shadow Sons discover his escape when they arrive at the Cooperage that evening, ready to carry out their death sentence. The carpenter's rage is incandescent, but it's also impotent. Their target is gone, their conspiracy is compromised, and their credibility within the broader Patriot movement has been destroyed by their turn toward vigilante justice. The group dissolves within weeks, its members either abandoning politics entirely or finding their way back to the mainstream Sons of Liberty. The carpenter himself disappears from historical records, his real name and ultimate fate lost to time. The broader Patriot movement, meanwhile, continues its evolution toward revolution, but along more moderate lines than the Shadow Sons had envisioned. The Boston Massacre, which occurs just 5 days after Seamus's escape, provides all the martyrdom and propaganda value that the extremists had hoped to achieve through kidnapping and assassination, but without the moral compromise that terrorism would have entailed. Samuel Adams, with his characteristic political acumen, uses the massacre to unite the Patriot movement around a narrative of British brutality and American victimhood. The soldiers who fired on the crowd become the villains, while the colonists who died become martyrs for liberty. It's a much more powerful story than anything the Shadow Sons could have created through their campaign of terror. But the cost of this more moderate approach is measured not just in the lives lost during the massacre, but in the life of the man who prevented a greater tragedy. Seamus O'Brien settles eventually in the Caribbean, where he establishes a successful business and raises a family that knows nothing of his role in American history. He follows the progress of the revolution from afar, reading newspaper accounts of battles and political developments, with the bitter knowledge that he helped make it possible through his betrayal of men who claimed to serve the same cause. He never returns to America, never learns whether his sacrifice was worthwhile, never knows if the moderate path he helped preserve ultimately led to a better outcome than the violent revolution the Shadow Sons had planned. But perhaps that uncertainty is the point. History is not a story with clear heroes and villains, obvious choices between good and evil. It's a complex web of human decisions and consequences, where good people make terrible choices for understandable reasons, where preventing one tragedy sometimes requires enabling another, where the price of moral purity is often paid by someone else. The lesson of the Shadow Sons conspiracy is not that violence is always wrong or that moderation is always right. It's that political movements, like individuals, face moments when they must choose between their principles and their goals, between their ideals and their effectiveness. The American Revolution succeeded, partly because enough people chose moderation over extremism, partly because men like Seamus O'Brien were willing to sacrifice themselves to prevent their cause from being corrupted by the very evil it opposed. But it also succeeded because the British government was foolish enough to provide the Patriots with genuine martyrs through events like the Boston Massacre, eliminating the need for the manufactured martyrdom that the Shadow Sons had planned to create through terrorism. The conspiracy that never happened reminds us that the path to American independence was not inevitable, that different choices by different people could have led to very different outcomes. The revolution we celebrate was shaped as much by the roads not taken as by the ones that were, as much by the violence that was prevented as by the violence that occurred. Stories like this remind us that behind every great historical movement are individuals making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, that the heroes we celebrate often succeeded because others were willing to sacrifice themselves in obscurity, that the price of liberty is sometimes paid not by those who fight for it, but by those who prevent it from being corrupted in the fighting. That's what we explore here, the hidden choices that shaped history, the moral dilemmas that tested ordinary people, the complex truth behind the simplified narratives we tell ourselves about our past. If you believe these stories matter, if you want to understand the real complexity of American history, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because there are so many more stories like this one, waiting to be told with the honesty and nuance they deserve. You won't want to miss what we discover next.